What we're going to do now is turn it over to Q&A from the audience, and I think Allie might be helping us with bringing the mics up to anybody who has a question. So I'll also let her field whose hands goes up first, and we'll be able to do this for about 15 minutes or so. So who has a question? Thanks, Allie.
In the early shows of the Dick Van Dyke Show, Alan Brady never showed his face. How did you decide to leave that behind and stop doing that?
That's a very honest and good question that I haven't answered. When I wrote the part of Alan Brady, by the way, the first name, his name was Alan Sturdy. I figured he was a sturdy guy. And Sheldon Leonard said, you know, that's not a good name. I said, why? He's because if you say it fast, Alan's dirty. It sounds like Alan's dirty. So I changed it to Alan Brady. That's how I got his name. And then and he didn't show up. I didn't write him in, but it's always good to have a good villain. Any movie, the best movies have the best, the best swashbucklers have the best villains. You know, the best villain of all was in Robin Hood. Those villains in Robin Hood, my God, the two great villains, Claude Rains, and the best movies have the best villains, and the best comedy shows have the best villains. It's usually the boss. Mm-hmm. You know, always fighting something. So we used him as an offstage character, the boss. You know, worried about the boss getting fired. If you're not vulnerable, you're not in good shape as in writing. So the vulnerability came from the boss. And we had this guy, Alan Brady, which was an offstage figure. And then when I decided that I needed a couple lines to see Alan Brady, I said, gee, who are we going to cast in this part? I said, whoever it is, they're not going to believe he's a great star because it was a small part, 2 or 3 lines. And I said, let's be a disembodied voice. Maybe we'll see the back of his head or on the telephone, and we'll hear the strong voice, you know, railing, an impossible man, based on, by the way, not Sid Caesar. Sid Caesar was a pussycat. We were friends, you know, we lunched every day. But it was based on an amalgam of 3 characters. It was Jackie Gleason, who never spoke to his writers. The writers used to write, and he used to slip the material under the door of his hotel room, and he'd read the material. He never spoke to his writers. It was always ranting and raving. Then there was Milton Berle, who had a whistle and always screamed at people. In rehearsal, he was a big screamer. And the character in Top Banana, what's his name? Phil Silvers played, based on these 2. So it was an amalgam of those 3 people, screaming, yelling. And I said, who we get for that? And I decided to do a voiceover, you know, not a voice, but a disembodied voice with just the back of my head. And I did it 2 or 3 times. Once he was behind the phone. Once he was in a barber shop, I remember. He had a towel over his face. And then we started, and he only showed up at maybe once every 10 or 13, maybe not even that often. Then once we wrote a show where there were very important lines, and I said, it's not fair to the writing or the writers not to have a face. You can make it much funny if you see a guy, you know, acting. So I decided to turn myself around. I turned around, and after that, I did 2 or 3 or 4 shows. I didn't do many, because and certainly in the first 4 years, I didn't want to do any, because in the first 3 years, I was all by myself. There was no executive producer. Sheldon was the executive producer, but I have no other producers but myself, and I was the head writer and the only writer. And if I used other writers, I did all the rewriting. So I needed time. I didn't want to. Spending time on the set would be hours, you know, rehearsing. So I never wanted to. The first few years, I stayed away from being on a set at all. Yes, more questions that I can answer. Here, okay, there. You're next. I see you.
Hi. So you've done a variety of things, you know, performing, directing, writing, across a variety
I also know how to make sauerkraut.
Do you? What about balloon animals? Are you drawn to any of those in particular, like more so than the other? And what kind of draws you, I guess, to the different ones?
Well, the thing that gives me most pleasure, most pleasure, believe it or not, you'll believe it because I'm telling you, is starting with a blank page and writing something. And it's the thing that gives me greatest pleasure is a novel. Because a novel, you don't need a producer, you don't need a lighting man, you don't need what is this guy? Huh?
The mic guy.
The mic guy, no. An engineer, you don't need engineers. it's you and the page and the gentle audience. It's just you and the page, and you're alone in a room with a book that somebody wrote. Sometimes it's a one-on-one thing, and the greatest pleasure is starting with an empty page and putting something down, and then continuing, and it becomes a book, and I've written, a few novels, 4 or 5, 6 novels, I don't know, and a few books based on enjoying myself more than any other way. By the way, I did this wonderful exercise. It happened to me a couple times, but put a first line. Everybody can write a first line. We used to play games. You write a first line, somebody writes a second line. I remember one book I wrote called All Kinds of Love. I decided I wanted to write I'd never written a romance novel. I decided I could write a romance novel. So I said, I'd like to start that. And I remember the first line. He didn't realize that hiring a Japanese tutor would impact his marriage as much as it did, or something like that. And I smiled just the way you're doing, and I said, okay, who is this guy who hired a Japanese tutor? Well, and I don't want to make him a doctor, because doctors you have to research about hysterosalpingogram, all these words. I said, and when I wrote Enter Laughing, I wrote about my business. That's something I knew the background of and all of the terminology. So I said, well, I don't make him a producer, half-ass producer, because I know about producing, I produce. So I'll make him a producer. Why is he hiring a Japanese tutor? Well, if he's a producer, he's probably going to do a movie. Maybe part of it's set in Japan. And why would it impact his marriage? Well, so he went to a Japanese restaurant and asked the guy, you know anybody who can teach Japanese? I want to learn a few words. And this guy sends a guy named Nobu. And Nobu comes in. It's a beautiful, beautiful woman. Her name is Nobu, and she's got a larger breast than most Asian people have, and she's taller than most, gorgeous. And she walks past the wife. And she says, darling, your translator is here. And we'll tell him to wait downstairs, That's it. And his wife was immediately jealous. And it started a whole book, and there was 6 different kinds of love in that book. And it was one of my favorite books. Of course, it was a dear book where the real love was the love of a very young boy and the Filipino twin maids. Filipino twin. He falls in love with one, and they get married and have a child. And he's like 18, 17 years old, and she's 20. And that was actually a real love story. The rest of them was pastiches. Anyway, that was my favorite thing. But it happened by putting down a one line and say, where does it go? And ask yourself questions. Who is this? Where does it go? What? And one line follows another, and all of a sudden you have a book. Not so all of a sudden.
The Dick Van Dyke Show had one of the great casts in the history of television. As the producer of the program, can you take us into the evolution of the casting of that show? Did you get everybody you wanted, or did somebody turn a role down that was then taken by one of the greats that followed?
Were we lucky? Were we lucky? I told you when Sheldon said, we'll get a better actor to play you, and he suggested Dick Van Dyke. I saw Dick Van Dyke, and he was in. The only tough piece of casting was casting the girl. And I remember going to the Morris office and asking to send me whoever they got, and I literally saw maybe 60 girls. I'm not kidding. Some really good actresses, but they weren't right. Dick Van Dyke had a certain personality. You had a match to that. You didn't want a strong, ballsy woman, And so we looked and looked and looked, and I said to Sheldon one day, Sheldon, I don't know what I'm looking for. And he said, you'll know when you see her. And keep looking. And he knew I had to be satisfied. So they sent this girl, Danny Thomas, I know how it happened. There was a wonderful actress in New York that I knew about. I hadn't seen her, but she got wonderful reviews in the play. And we spent $500 to get her out here for an audition. And we had to tell Danny Thomas, who was footing the bill for all this. He says, who are you sending? And we told him about this girl. And so she came out, and she was really wrong for it. They didn't mesh at all. And then he said, who is that girl who read for my daughter a few years ago when I did the Danny Thomas show, and she had the wrong nose to be my daughter. sloped the wrong way. So he said she had 3 names, and she was in the Richard Diamond series. Her legs were singing, and her voice was heard. And somebody said Mary Tyler Moore. So we called somebody and said, find Mary Tyler Moore, and I'll see her. And they called her, and she didn't want to come in. She had been up to auditions all that week, and a week before she had failed like 5 times in a row. And she said, I'm not going to get another failure. They talked her into coming. She walked into my office, and literally she sat down, and I handed her a script, and I asked her to read the first line or two. Literally, the line was nothing more like, hello, darling, or whatever it was, but she had this, what I called a ping in her voice. I heard it immediately. I said, oh my God, that is so, it caught me. And first of all, she looked, she standing there looking like Mary Tyler Moore. But she was young. She was like 23 years old. And I remember going over to her, like, the claw, those things that pick up balls of candy. I went over with a claw, and I grabbed the top of her head, and she got scared. She thought I was going to accost her. I said, come with me, young lady. And I picked her up, and I kept my hand on her, and I walked her into Sheldon's office. Sheldon, you're right, I found her. And she got scared. Anyway, but and the only objection we had is Dick was about 34, 5 years old, and she was 23. And he said, she's much too young for me. I said, Cary Grant is 60 years old. He's playing with Leslie Caron or whatever it is, I said, it's an accepted thing in motion pictures that a girl can be 12 years old and the guy can be 94. Good match, Anyway, so it worked out pretty well. They were, and now the casting of the rest of it was very easy. Sheldon immediately said, there's only one girl who can play the part. And it was based on 2 women I knew in television that were writers. The original writer on the show of shows was Lucille Callan, a young girl writer, and Selma Diamond, who came on to the show of shows later. And we're looking for a woman to be there. And Sheldon said, Rosemary's the only girl who can do that. And she came in to see me, and of course she was perfect. And I was looking for a young Mel Brooks kind of guy, a long, feisty guy throwing things around. And she suggested an old feisty guy. She suggested, but the other part, Buddy, should be played by her buddy was Maury Amsterdam, who also wrote jokes for her. So she loved him because he was a human joke machine. He can make jokes at any subject in the world. So that's how that was cast. And Richard Deacon was just one of those lucky things. I had seen him somewhere, and I said, there's the kind of guy. And a bald guy, boy, 1 million jokes, because Maury had 1 million spritzers about a guy being bald. Yeah, so that was the cast. And the kid, of course, was a kid. I don't think there was any, casting Alan Brady was easy. Yeah.
You had some connections
Yeah.
there. Well, thank you very, very much, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.